I beefed my characters up a lot more than I had to as well, so I probably didn't need to spend that much time on the game, but it definitely added to the length. What else was I gonna say about it? I don't remember. I had a point that I didn't list, but it came to my mind, and now I just lost it. Oh well. It'll probably come back to me later. The storyline of the game, I will say I was glad to have a story that was being told to me as the game went on. That's one thing I really didn't like about the first Final Fantasy, was that it had more of an implied story, and I think I read afterwards that much of the story was contained in the instruction manual, at least with the original game. I don't know so much about with the GBA version, but I had read that a lot of the story was contained within the instruction manual, and that was the case with a lot of games back in the NES days. But yeah, it was nice to actually have a story, unfold and be told as the game went on, and not just kind of, oh, you're supposed to know you're doing this. It was a pretty cliched story. It was your standard, evil empire versus rebellion affair, and we've seen that before. It was not a bad story, but it wasn't really overly compelling or exciting at any point. And there were certain parts of the game that I just considered blatant rip-offs of, like, Star Wars. The first main objective you have in the game comes when you find out that the Empire has this huge airship called the Death Star. I mean the Dreadnought. Sorry. And you have to destroy it by skimming along its trench. Going inside the engine room and firing a proton torpedo into a shaft no bigger than a wait, no. You have to drop the Sunfire into the engine room. Yeah. Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million. After I destroyed it, I was sitting there going, you know what? I bet the Empire is going to strike back. And then I facepalmed. But yeah, I was just like, really? That's a little close there, don't you think? And then there's another scene where you go, because you're basically Princess Hilda is one of the main characters, and you're basically her bitch throughout the entire game. She sends you on errands to help them fight the Empire, and at one point she sends you somewhere, and she feels bad because she's like, I'm sending you everywhere. I feel bad about it. So she decides the least she can do is get into an airship and meet you there, even though you're going to come back anyway. And on the way there, she gets abducted by the Dreadnought, and I swear to God, the scene mirrors the the Star Wars scene at the very beginning of the wiping my nose. At the very beginning of the Episode 4, where Princess Leia's ship gets abducted by the Star Destroyer. It looks just like that. She's flying, and all of a sudden the Dreadnought comes, and they're like, oh shit, and they turn away, and then the Dreadnought just like picks them up with a claw, and the underbelly. I'm like, wow, that's and not to mention the main protagonist, not the main antagonist of the game, is Emperor Palamecia. It's like, I don't know if they were going for it or if it's just a huge coincidence, but I just thought the plot was really Star Warsy. I was really disappointed by the Emperor in more ways than one. As a main villain, I just didn't think he had enough presence in the game, and he wasn't really built up that much. He was mentioned, actually, now that I think it was more, it wasn't so much him, it was the Empire as a whole that was talked about, but he really doesn't show up that much, and you really don't feel anything for him. And I think that's one of the main things about having a good villain, is you need to have him built up, and you need to have his presence, like, you just really need to feel something, even if you like root for him. Like some villains you root for, and I just didn't really feel anything about him at the end of the game, except that he was a huge pussy. The characters, I was glad that the characters had some form of individuality. I think I mentioned in my Final Fantasy 1 review that I felt the characters are more like mannequins. I mean, you create the character, you know, you name them, you pick what they are, so they're not really going to have any sort of individuality since they're going to change from game to game. In Final Fantasy 2, they're more static characters, so they do have dialogue, they do have... They don't really have personalities. I mean, Furion doesn't really have any spunk to him. In fact, his and Maria's dialogue sound very similar in tone. The only difference between the characters is one has silver hair and a weird turban thingy, and the other one has purple hair and boobs. Guy, your third character, he actually did have a bit of personality just because the way he talked, you could tell he had a few screws loose. You know, like, I think at the ending scene that I recorded, he's like, yeah, war over. You could just tell he's kind of the big dumb guy, like Andre the Giant's character in The Princess Bride. That was kind of Guy. So I actually feel like he had the most. He didn't have much dialogue, but I think he had the most individuality to him of all the characters, all the player characters at least. There were a few. I think the NPC characters were a lot more compelling. I liked Gordon. He was the prince who. His father and his brother dies at the beginning of the game, and he kind of inherits the throne, so to speak. But he's like made off as a coward, and so like throughout the game, he gets more and more responsibility put on him, and at the end of the game, he kind of becomes, you know, the leader everyone wants him to be. So I thought that was kind of cool. I also liked Paul, who's this thief that keeps helping you throughout the game, and some of the stuff he does is just awesome. Like, one part, you have to infiltrate the Emperor's castle. And it's built on this mountain range, and it's not accessible by land. So you go to see him, and he's like, oh yeah, you gotta do it through the air. I once did it, I basically hang glided through the air on a freaking kite. You know, he was just awesome. I thought some of the things he pulled off. And he gives you a lot of good, at the end of the game, he lets you into his treasure room, and he's just got a lot of great, like, loot and stuff. I was really, like I said, I was really disappointed by the Emperor as a character. He just wasn't as compelling as I would have liked him to be. And he only shows up a handful of times throughout the game. I think you see him in the intro to the game, the opening scene. I don't remember if he had a line or not, a line of dialogue. Then you don't see him again at all until, like, halfway through the game, around halfway through the game, maybe a little less than that. You have to go rescue Princess Hilda a second time, because the bitch gets captured about as much as Princess Peach. And, he has some dialogue, but you only really see him for, like, 30 seconds. And then you don't see him again at all, sorry, until, like, one of the final dungeons. Basically, the Emperor summons this huge-ass cyclone that is able to rampage, like, half the world. And you go infiltrate his cyclone fortress, and you fight him there, finally, and it was so pathetic. I think I beat him, and, like, once, like, he has a few, like, regular monsters with him in the fight. Once I plowed through those guys and it was just the Emperor left, I already had my party beefed up with, like, buffs and berserk. I think I beat him in one turn with Furion and Guy's attacks. I was just like, really? This is the big bad Emperor that we've been busting our ass the entire game to beat, and we just, like, decimate him in one turn? They make me spend, like, 10 hours going after this ultimate magic called Ultima, you know. I think that this was the its debut in Final Fantasy. And it was actually a pretty shitty spell. And I didn't even use it. I ended up beating the Emperor both times with just my regular attacks. It was just ridiculous. The difficulty of the game and the combat, I actually found it easier than the first Final Fantasy, simply because the attribute system and knowing how to level up all my attributes, my characters were so overly powered. I also felt that when you increase an individual attribute, uh, it seems to make more difference in your strength than actual levels, like in Final Fantasy 1. Just like like levels are like your HP when you gain a level is a predetermined increase. Your MP is a predetermined increase. Your stats increase by a predetermined amount. But your attributes, you have more control over them. The more you do something, the more this attribute is going to increase. So you can really pump it up there. Whereas with levels, you don't have that much control with. None of the bosses were really challenging at all. Once I beefed myself up with the Berserk, they went down within like 2 turns. You have 4 party members, but throughout most of the game, I pretended like I only had 3.